topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Leese. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. A warm welcome to everybody. We're delighted you could join us today for this Thursday live discussion across X and YouTube and other social media. It is June the 20th, 2024, the year of our Lord. And we've got lots to talk about today. And I'm really quite excited about today's discussion because it's really going to be about energy. And a very interesting subtopic is going to be about hydrogen. You may have heard that there's a lot of interesting ideas about hydrogen, and it's some would think it's a significant part of our energy future. Some would even say perhaps a panacea in some circles. Well, but you get the idea that there's a lot of ideas about energy, and we know that energy is foundational to civilization. So if we can kind of figure this out, this is one of the key breakthroughs that will enable our civilization to continue to prosper, to grow, and certainly make our standard of living better. So we're excited that you're here, part of our conversation. And again, I want to thank you for your reviews and comments. It's amazing the hundreds of comments we get from coast to coast and from other parts of the world. And so we do appreciate that feedback. And we really certainly encourage you to share these recordings with others in your circles if you think it's important. If you look at the current state of affairs, if you look at the future for not only ourselves, but for the next generation, we encourage you to share what we're doing here. So we really do appreciate your kind support. So, and on that note, please be sure to ask your questions as usual. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And because today I'm very excited to have a special guest. He's certainly been working with Frontier, an associate. His name is Hugo Kruger, and he and one of our senior fellows at Frontier, Ian Madsen, wrote a very interesting paper about hydrogen. And Hugo, a warm welcome to you.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me here.
Well, Hugo, it's an honor to have you here. You're an accomplished podcaster, and you are a nuclear engineer. I've had occasion to meet some nuclear engineers, so they're very special people. And you have got quite a background in terms of analyzing and looking at the fields of energy and so many other issues, and including, of course, nuclear power, liquefied natural gas or LNG, and all kinds of other renewable technologies. And you've certainly done an awful lot of studies both in Paris and the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So it's an honor to have you, Hugo.
Oh, thank you
So
very much.
can you tell us a little bit more about how you ended up getting so heavily involved in this whole field of energy?
Sure. So, my background's actually in civil engineering, but I did my master's in nuclear engineering. So just to sort of clarify that,
Mhm.
I started, well, get back to where it started, I suppose. My grandfather was a material scientist who worked in the coal industry, and in particular, South Africa at the time was sanctioned during the apartheid years. And because of the sanctions, the government at the time said, okay, we are oily independent country. And he worked at the CSIR at the time, and that's where they invested a lot of money into coal to oils technology, which is Sasol, flagship company back home. And he in particular worked on fly ash technology, which was used to actually extend the properties of cement. So, for example, when they built the Hoover Dam in the 1930s, they had to redirect the water of the dams to cool it. If you use
Mhm.
the coal ash, the fly ash, pulverized fly ash in cement, you don't have to do that. So
Okay, so
immediately,
just hold on for a sec there. That is a fascinating example. So you're taking, when you refer to fly ash, you mean the ash off of coal-fired facilities and then reusing that to make
yes,
concrete stronger, and better. Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. It enhances the properties of concrete, and that the Japanese actually was the first country to do it, and South Africa invested a lot
Interesting.
into it because we have so much coal. To be honest, we didn't know what to do with all the ash.
Mhm.
That was when the environmental revolution sort of started. It was actually predates it a little bit. It was sort of an economics question. What do we do with all the ash? And some of that you can reprocess.
Mhm.
So I always had a background in energy, I suppose, growing up through him. Just understanding the coal value chain, and coal itself is not just about electricity. It's used in steel making, it's used in dynamite, it's used in South Africa's case in gasoline. You would say gasoline, we say petrol for our cars. There's a lot of applications from the coal value chain. And that's the first one. So I started working in the cement industry actually. And then I got a master's to do my a scholarship to do my master's in France, which I did then in nuclear. And then I worked on the design of Hinkley Point C in the UK. I worked at ITER, the International Thermonuclear Reactor in the south of France. And
Mhm.
then I jumped ship from the nuclear industry to the oil and gas industry. And in about I recently restarted nuclear, but it was about 5 years I worked in oil and gas in reservoir construction and in what we call gravity-based structures, the design of floating structures. So I got a broad, you could say, experience from the energy sector. I also worked in offshore wind for what it's worth. So I understand a bit about the renewables and I don't think it'll surprise your listeners, but the concept of an oil company doesn't really exist anymore. They're all energy companies, all the big ones, with maybe the
Mm.
exception of Exxon. But they Total Energy, so they invest in renewables, but they invest in fossil fuels, and they invest in everything. And then obviously you've got, in the case of France and in Canada, Ontario, you've got nuclear. So there's a lot going on in the energy sector. There's a lot going on in the electricity sector, and there's a lot of value chains attached to it. And what concerned me a little bit, particularly with the climate debate, is how I got into publicly speaking about it. Is there's a big deviation between what the engineers know we can deliver and what the physics allows us to deliver, and then what the politicians say we can do. And that frightened
Oh,
me a little bit. This gap between engineering reality and public perception was quite wide.
interesting.
That's why I started writing and saying, well, if you're going to go green, this is going to cost you. If you're going to move away from coal, you need to be aware of these things and those things.
Hmm.
And then that's sort of the questions I started highlighting.
So you dare to go where very few have gone before as an engineer to wade into the public square, helping us all understand better. And there's always healthy debate and discussion. This confusing world of rhetoric, if you will, around so many energy sources. I mean, there's every day someone is touting this and that option as kind of and I don't want to put false words into people's mouths, but the kind of the panacea of energy sources. And so I really I would say bravo on you, Hugo, for you and others, including senior fellow at Frontier Ian Madsen, for trying to look critically at these issues and saying rationally what options really do serve us. And I think part of this is very humbling because these issues are complicated. They're not easy to always understand, and they're dynamic. Like there's different sources of energy that have historically been involved in the building of certainly the Western civilization as we know it in the world, like coal. But coal has kind of a bad image, and yet it's changed too tremendously, hasn't it? I mean, like I'm here in sunny Winnipeg, and it's a beautiful day. And yet, in so many, I remember going to so many places, like particularly in Eastern Europe, where so much of the energy was from coal. Gosh, you could hardly see the sun when it was, it was is seen as dirty. And but that's changed a lot. Like coal has been revolutionized, as one example, has it not?
Yeah, coal has been. I mean, so with the Clean Air Act in the United States, and actually all of these things, actually, it's interesting that if you look at the real data, they almost predate the environmental revolution. But there's a
Hmm.
few things that coalesced, and people said we don't want dirty air, and then the engineers said, okay, we can have scrubbers to get the SO2 out, for example, the NOxes and stuff. And by and large, the coal we burn today is a distance away from what we had during Charles Dickens's time, with the exception of a few places in the world where they don't have
Hmm.
desulfurization technology and flue gas technology and all kinds of back-end processes. But mostly, I mean, even the coal in China, which is an unspoken truth, any new power station built in China today is cleaner than any power station you'll find in Europe or North America. So the
Pardon
story is
me?
yes,
Is
yes,
that true? The Chinese are ahead of us on that one as well.
Yes, and the Chinese, by the way, are not building a lot more coal. They're upgrading the existing stations to newer models. So
Mm,
they lower critical, the supercritical stations they're building, and the subcritical ones they're phasing out. Okay, so that's part of the story that's not being told. Is that yes, we are criticizing China for burning coal.
hmm.
They're burning a lot, and we can debate if they should. And Indonesia is burning, and Vietnam is building, and India is. But this technology that they are deploying at the moment is not the same technology that we used in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, why would
Hmm.
they?
Yeah.
It just makes no
Well,
sense. But
yeah.
this is the picture we're having about coal. So it's part of the misleading narrative. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of it just has to be because people don't understand it. They're far away from it. In Western countries, we don't work. There's not as big a percentage of the population anymore in manufacturing as there used to
Hmm.
be. So they're far away from the supply chain. So when you're far away from things, your perception of it is not in reality, I would say.
Well, we've already learned something new today, and I hope the audience is finding this bit of a taste of our discussion quite interesting. Who knew that the Chinese are doing what would be a logical, rational approach to business investment, and that is to actually renew an existing facility, clean it up, and go forward. So that's a very interesting international insight. As you come in from Paris, no less, Hugo. Um, so you wrote a very interesting paper with Ian Madsen about why we should be skeptical of the hydrogen economy. We've heard a lot about the hydrogen economy, and we've heard it from a lot of different voices, including even our prime minister and ministers of environment federally. So I wanted to share this interesting clip, and I do want to set the stage here for you and our audience here, and that is that we in Canada have one of the largest reserves in
Mm.
the world of oil and gas, as you full well know, and I think coal for that matter as well. And it's interesting. We've had a parade of leaders coming from in around the world. I can think of a number of right off the top, the presidents of Germany, as well as Japan, and
Hmm.
of course Greece was most recently. And there's been a number of others, and I certainly don't want to offend them, but they've all come uh, really asking for more energy from Canada. So I wanted to share this clip here in terms of kind of an introduction to this kind of discussion.
Coming together at what Prime Minister Trudeau called an historic bilateral meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, it didn't take long for the two leaders to blast Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine.
Putin made a terrible mistake. Germany is supporting Ukraine intensely.
Trudeau said while Putin sought to fracture the West, the conflict has brought allies like Canada and Germany even closer together.
Canada needs a strong Germany, and Germany needs a strong Canada.
Now the question is how quickly the friendship can help alleviate Germany's looming energy crisis. Germany relies heavily on Russian gas, and Moscow has been accused of holding back supply in a retaliatory move against Western sanctions. That's caused prices to soar just months before winter.
And it just means that people aren't going to be able to afford to heat their homes properly, that they're going to have to curtail industries that are energy intensive.
We are working hard to become independent of this gas supply.
The two leaders defended Canada's decision to allow turbines used on Russia's state-owned pipeline to be repaired in Montreal, a choice that caused outrage in Ukraine.
What we have done is remove the excuse that Russia had to blame someone else, anyone else, for their decision to weaponize energy policy.
Canada has an abundance of natural gas, most of it coming from Western provinces. As Germany scrambles to increase its capacity to import, the Prime Minister is not convinced it makes sense to move gas all the way to the East Coast for export to Europe.
There needs to be a business case. It needs to make sense.
Analysts wonder what the priority will be, the need to push toward a green economy or building capacity to send gas directly to our allies.
So it all comes down to pipelines and ports or rail to get it to ports.
Right now, our best capacity is to continue to contribute to the global market.
The Chancellor's visit will continue with an official dinner in Toronto. Then the two leaders are scheduled to travel to Newfoundland, where they'll sign an agreement for Canada to send clean hydrogen to Germany. Dan Spector, Global News, Montreal.
There you have it. It's a very interesting clip. There's a lot of issues there to
Mm.
peel away here, not the least of which is the last statement. And I'll go back and go at some of the other ones, Hugo. But I'm curious, what do you think of that last statement that Canada is declining to increase its exports of oil and gas to a country like Germany, a significant ally and friend? That want to be energy independent from people, dictators like who is it again? Oh yeah, Vladimir Putin, no less. And they're looking to us for leadership, and yet the response is, well, we'll we'll come back to you later about hydrogen. So is that really a viable opportunity? Does it even have a business case, Hugo?
Well, the LNG certainly has a business case because the European Union's leader, Ursula von der Leyen, she went to the other dictator in Azerbaijan, Aliyev, to beg for oil after the invasion. So
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? So they knocked on our door and then they got a no, so they went where?
they went to Azerbaijan. That is also a
Oh,
dictatorship. Okay. Or
gosh,
they
so
go
they
to
have
Qatar.
choices.
You
They
have
have
choices
choices,
between
don't they?
your choices. But I mean, Canada is a democratic oil state, if I explain the way. So we
Yes.
explain this way. The Middle Eastern countries are going into nuclear and they're building solar and wind domestically at the moment, so they can export their hydrocarbons on the world market. So, but you
Mm,
don't burn domestically, you export. Now, Canada, for your electricity, has hydro and nuclear historically, and now you've got some renewables, which makes sense. Okay, you've got some natural gas, but that puts you in a good position to export.
mhm,
That's Canada's strategy. It's a good position to be in because that means that your local electricity prices is not as susceptible to price fluctuations of the natural gas.
mm,
Germany, because they pushed the energy vendor so far, and because they've heavy industry, has always required cheap natural gas coming in from Russia.
mhm,
And the Russians were selling the gas in a fortunate position because after the end of the Soviet Union, Gazprom had almost no debt, so they could outprice the European competitors. And Russia had that market. And now with the war, and we still don't know who blew up the pipeline, sort of what has been said. But be that as it may, the Germans are in a difficult geopolitical position, and you would think Canada and the United States would be ideal countries to buy from. But if you shut the door on them, they would go to Azerbaijan. They would go to
well,
Qatar.
and I thought we were friends. Why would you close your door on a friend? So, the, but the whole idea of exporting hydrogen, is that really, what's the short answer to this question? Is it really viable, Hugo?
Everything is viable at the premium. Okay, everything is viable if you pay enough money for it, and that's the ultimate crux of this. So, what is the if you take the price of LNG times what factor what price do you want to add to that to have the equivalent in hydrogen?
Hmm.
Hydrogen, wherever it is produced in the world, is consumed next to where it's produced at the moment. So South Africa has Sasol, where we make coal to oil, coal to liquids. We produce hydrogen in the process. We use it for the Fischer-Tropsch process, and it's almost instantaneously consumed where it's produced. And the reason is transportation and storage of hydrogen is enormously expensive and safety.
Mm.
The Hindenburg exploded for a reason because it was hydrogen. So
The large airship, the
the last
Hindenburg
airship, yes.
was based on hydrogen, was it not? Yes.
It, and if you take hydrogen has a few physical characteristics, and this was the crux of our critique, it was an argument from first principles to say
Hmm.
hydrogen is a low ignition point temperature, so it blows up very easily. So you have to keep it in a liquid state to transport it. To keep it in liquid state, you need a lot of pressure. You need more pressure than natural gas, so you need more energy. That's going to cost money. Then you face the other issue, and this is the fundamental critique against hydrogen. If you take the amount of energy by volume, it's got 1/3 of the energy by volume of natural gas. So you need 3 times the pipelines to have the equivalent
Mm.
volume for energy. Okay. Or
Mhm.
if you have a car, it goes 1/3 of the distance, or if an airplane, you have to throw out 1/3 of the passengers. But somewhere you have to compromise. And if you want the same performance, it explodes the cost. And that's sort of the point about this whole thing is, yes, you can do it. I'm sure there's businesses doing it. But if you look at the subsidies they're getting and you look at just the cost to the end user, it's more expensive than the alternative, which is natural gas at the moment.
Mm. Okay, so that's very helpful to as a quote layperson if we look at evaluating energy, we can say we can look at this through asking some basic questions, some criteria that help us understand what are the viable options for energy. And you're saying in this case, in hydrogen, yes, it can work in some cases, but you have to really look at it critically and say, is it being subsidized? Is
Mhm.
it being somehow propped up in other clever ways through regulation or the law? Um, and so you have to look at these issues critically. So if you had to help us understand how we look at evaluating whether or not different energy options are viable, what are some of the principles or what's the lens that you use to answer that question?
So the first question I ask is, what is the application of the energy source? There's 7 major sources of electricity generation in the world, which is hydro, coal, nuclear, liquefied natural gas,
Mhm,
wind, solar. So you can get all 7 of them, and they've got all different applications. The quality of energy is not the same from all of them, first of all.
mhm,
So do you want reliability? Do you want all of those things for electricity? Then you need to ask the question, do you want to use it in the broader energy sense? Are you going to use your natural gas for industrial feedstock, which is what the Germans are doing, to make
mhm,
metal, to make steel, to help burn with the process of the heavy manufacturing? That's the, then you say, okay, if I need to do that, how far am I? What does my logistics look like? How far am I between production and consumption? One major disadvantage that Russia has in natural gas, for example, is the fact that its gas pipelines is now going to the Yamal Peninsula in the north, which is very cold and difficult to extract. Well, if you
mhm,
compare that to the United States, it's in Pennsylvania and Texas, almost next to where it's consumed. That's an enormous advantage from logistics perspective. Okay, so you would look at what is the challenge of the country or the challenge of the industry, and then you would say, what is the base source that can meet that demand, obviously at the lowest cost, so I can extract the highest value for it. And that's where you would say LNG has got this enormous advantage that it is got an ideal energy by mass and volume. Okay,
mhm,
it fits the optimal curves. It's got an ideal cost. It's relatively easy to transport. Yes, you need to keep it in a compressed liquid state,
mhm,
but it doesn't take that much energy to do so, and it's safe in a liquefied state to transport. It doesn't, you don't have to have extra safety protocols, outside of what is normally acceptable for it. So it fits a broad set of criteria. And then LNG in the electricity system can be either base load, it can be called mid-merit, so it fluctuates in demand, or it can be peakful, it can be used for peaking. So it
mhm,
can do what almost all the other 6 energy sources can do at once. So it's got versatile applications. And that makes it such a competitive product. Okay, and
mhm,
then also methane, it's debatable, but methane has half the CO2 emissions of coal, for example.
mhm. So that kind of response, and it's I think a very um, incisive summary of how to look at the top level how to evaluate energy. And what this says to me is that the president of Germany, among other countries, obviously is aware of that framework. So, does that mean then that when the president of Germany came to Canada in that clip, I believe it was like a good year and a half ago, that our prime minister is not aware of that framework or what's going on? Because obviously, we in Canada have this extraordinary advantage of having um, sources of LNG, which is relatively clean and powerful in terms of an energy product, as you just outlined. And we're in kind of a northern climate where it's actually easier to process to make it colder because we're not like in Texas or Louisiana where it's hotter. What what does the president of Germany know that our prime minister doesn't?
Well, the president of Germany is facing pressure from its own electorate
Mhm.
because if he does not find a source of natural gas, regardless of what he said to be elected, because he had a coalition in Germany of the Greens as well, regardless of what he
Yes.
said, he'll be out of office tomorrow. Okay. So there's electoral pressure in Germany to find a solution to the jobs crisis, to the energy crisis, and to the fact that our heavy industries are going. And where's the German heavy industry going? To North America, where there's natural gas. Okay. So,
Say,
so the
so
Germans
there's a
understand
story
this
within a
very
story here.
clearly.
So you're saying that Germany, if they don't figure out, if they don't know how to thread the needle of this energy question, they are hooped. They are going into a kind of a phase of deindustrialization as that industry migrates to where the energy is, namely in the United States. But Canada is still saying no. Is that,
Yeah.
am I misreading this?
That's misreading. Now you must ask the question, why is Canada saying no? Now, you're Canadian, you probably know better than me, but I would presume that the oil states or the natural gas states might not have been in Justin Trudeau's frame of mind of getting re-elected. He thought
Okay,
maybe I'm
so
not going to win them anyway, so why bother?
yeah. Okay, but this is a classic case where, political actors are different. They don't necessarily govern for the interests of the people, they govern for short-term political power games.
Yeah.
Um,
But
Probably.
for
Yeah.
Canada in general, it makes no sense what he wants to do. Look, Trudeau is he does sing along with the green transition, as do most leaders.
Hmm.
But if you look at the energy transition, which is maybe spend a bit of time on what that means, it
Yes,
essentially
please help
means
us.
mass electrification. You're going to phase out fossil fuels. You're going to get rid of all the redundancies in the system.
Hmm.
And it's going to be wind, solar, and batteries, and some of them except nuclear, which is fine. Okay, it can
Hmm.
all work at a cost. Okay, this is the point of all of these things.
Hmm.
The trouble with that is fossil fuels is still 80% of primary energy. It's not a simple task, and it's not going to cost nothing to phase that out.
Right.
And what Western countries have done up until now has been purely symbolic. Okay,
Hmm.
it makes no sense, or it makes political sense, but no sense if Ontario, for example, says we're going to phase out fossil fuels for electricity because you've got nuclear everywhere. Okay,
Hmm.
and Sweden, for example, passed a carbon tax when nobody was on products that they were not using at one stage. So there's a lot of symbolism with this going on. But the big
Symbolism.
but the big energy demand at the moment is where the growing populations of the world is and the growing industrialization is. And that is not in Western countries. It's not even in China anymore. It's almost ending in China. It's now in India and soon to be Africa, where I'm from.
Interesting. Wow.
And by the end of this century, Africa's population will be 4 out of 10 people. Asia will be 4 out of 10, and Europe and North America is maybe 1.5, depending on which statistic you ask. So whatever they do in the Western countries is largely symbolic. If you truly cared about the energy transition, you would focus the technology on where the population growth is occurring at the moment. And if you look at what those countries are doing, many of them, especially in Southeast Asia, are sticking with coal.
So
So I ask
this is,
myself, where is the energy transition if that is happening,
yeah.
if that is what's happening?
No, I think that's a brilliant insight, Hugo. And I just, what another revelation as we look at not just simply the Canadian limited perspective, but the international world perspective, is the demand on energy has never been greater, and it's
Uh,
shifting. And your powerful reference to the demands of energy in Africa, India, um, among others, it begs the question: how does Canada actually help meet the incredible energy demands from the rest of the world, and thereby actually help the energy transition and help the standard of living of our fellow human beings around the world? Is that what you're
yeah.
saying in another way?
You can also argue it from an environmental perspective. Okay, what you just said is true. Up to 40% of primary energy in Africa at this point in time is deforestation. The fastest
Sorry,
way to bring
40%. 40%
40%,
is
40, okay?
deforestation, like
It's
wood.
wood. This is chopping of wood. So,
My, oh
if
my,
you
I
were
never
to
realized it was that
bring
high.
solar panels with natural gas, which is an ideal combination for poor countries, you would obviously reverse some of those trends. If you provide people indoor cooking, okay, as
Hmm.
opposed to you cooking on open furnaces or cooking indoor with sometimes with trash cans or like whatever they can find wood
Yeah.
inside, you would
And
reverse
dung?
childhood pneumonia. So the argument to a lot of these things is it's the economy. And the quicker we can get energy, whatever the source, to people, the better. And then when the standards of living starts rising, automatically, as we spoke earlier with the clean coal in Europe and North America, it will occur.
Hmm.
In fact, it is already occurring with the newest and the latest coal and the latest LNG and latest solar and wind in Africa. So that is already occurring, the technology of fusion. But you would focus where you can have the highest return. But my
Exactly.
sense has been, and Canada is not alone in this, France does the same. I mean,
Hmm.
we're going to have an election soon again in France, and Macron was reminded the other day, did you know France is only something like 1.2% of the world's CO2? We have nuclear. Are you aware that we have nuclear
Mm.
everywhere? That's not carbon.
Yes.
And you're committing to this. What are you doing? Is what they've been asking. It's very similar
Mm.
thing, I think, in Canada, where one, I think honestly the leaders just don't understand the physics. I think they just detach
Mm.
from reality. And the second one
Mhm.
is I think their intention is primarily to get reelected, as opposed to
Uh-huh.
actually making a real impact into this. I mean, Canada has an
Gosh.
excellent LNG market. There's nothing wrong with it. And if Canada
Mhm.
were to establish it around the world and to export, first of all, you take money away from the oil dictatorships in the Middle
Mm.
East. Okay, my wife's from the Middle East. They need less oil. Okay, because that keeps
Mhm.
their governments entrenched and in power. So it'll be great if a
Mhm.
democratic country can rival and compete against them.
Yes.
And then the other one is, as we just say, you actually help the development of those countries. So it's a win-win situation to export what is your best product. But
Wow.
we should stop being ashamed of it.
No, I love the way you think, Hugo, because you're really pointing out the profound nature of energy. I mean, we know it's all, foundational to our quality of life in every respect. But you're also challenging the typical narratives and confusing nonsense about how the fact is that we could actually really help the world succeed on every front, whether it's health. Like you can imagine people, many of which are women, cooking around a very dirty fuel source. I mean, the health impacts on people are horrendous. And you think of also enabling people to enable their societies to go forward, to be able to prosper. I mean, this is and it's so funny because you said, look, I'm trying to remember the phrase you used, but essentially, this has a stunning economics business case. But it's clear
Yeah.
that our politicians don't have a clue about what a business case is. Otherwise, they'd be all over this, wouldn't we? We'd be able to make more money exporting. We'd be able to help people succeed because all this stuff is hurting a lot of people and holding them back. Am I? And the environment would be better off too. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think everything would be better off if you just keep on, if you let the best technology compete. And if that happens to be a renewable technology, I'm not going to, I'm not going to burn coal for the sake of burning it. But I'm saying if in the absence of an alternative, this is better because
Yes.
the alternative is poverty, right? The,
Right.
alter-
Poverty.
which is much wood, which kills people. I mean, you
Yeah.
can measure it. You can. It's just so there's a moral case to saying, let's develop and let's export all our energy sources.
Right.
And I believe that fossil fuels will eventually die their own natural death, whether
Hmm.
through
Hmm.
nuclear. And we're seeing an incredible adaptation of solar power in Africa at the moment, which
Hmm.
is great. And the battery price, we wrote this in our article, is falling. It's not there yet, but it might be. I mean, I don't predict the future.
Okay.
It might be at a
Yeah.
point where it replaces some of these things.
Hmm.
And if that happens, all the better. Okay.
Yes.
But at the
Yeah.
moment, there should not be any impediment to any energy development. And the thing that my experience has been with politicians, and I've spoken to people in France and South Africa on this, is even though they make public statements like Justin Trudeau did there, I find privately some of them are more cautious,
Mm.
especially if you find those in the administration state around it, because I was
Hmm.
in France in 2018 when Emmanuel Macron passed the tax on diesel,
Hmm.
your carbon tax on diesel. That tax alone caused the Gilets jaunes riots, and he has not recovered politically since from then. And he's
Isn't
well
that
aware
interesting?
of these things. So he says these things, but you can find that he's actually felt there's a real price. There's a
Hmm.
very high correlation between energy prices and inflation. And we know inflation can swing an election, right? So
Indeed.
I find that, and I think it's a good thing to just make them aware of this, to say, okay, if you want to block LNG, do you know which jobs you're going to kill in Canada? Do you know the price, the impact on the economy? And are you aware that this is going to cost you politically? And you
I think
find
that's a
then
great
quickly they
insight.
start backtracking.
So when you look at energy, obviously, if you don't enable the market
Yeah.
to engage in energy adaptation and innovation and all the rest, you're going to create inflation, and you're going to create problems in people's lives. And are you saying that part of bad energy policy, then the blockages that you're referring to, have had a direct correlation with, frankly, the political revolution that's happening now in many parts of the European Parliament this last week? where you've had government after government, certainly in EU representation, the European Parliament, you've had a huge tidal wave of changes of representatives who say we're listening to these concerns about affordability. You've seen the protests of
Mm.
hundreds of thousands of farmers and all kinds of people on streets. You don't hear about it much in the mainstream media here in Canada, but these are protests right across Europe. Is the correlation then between those protests and bad energy policy?
Well, it's crystal clear to me that it's the case. I mean, the Netherlands, the Farmers' Party is now the third largest party, or something like that. Okay, in
Hmm.
France, there's now a real chance that Marine Le Pen might either beat or she'll win a great number of representatives in the next election against Emmanuel Macron. And the challenge is if the mainstream parties, the traditional parties in Canada or America or France, isn't talking about it, the only people that are latching onto it are the extremists.
Mm.
Okay. So you're going to embolden certain political forces that you don't want because you're not being open and honest about your energy policy. And any policy has a cost associated to it. One of my biggest frustrations in the whole energy debate is not whether we're going for decarbonization or not. I can sort of get behind it. I say, okay, if we want to do it, there might be a few ways to do it,
Mm.
but it is that they never do what we call a brownfields scenario. What does the existing system cost, and what are the benefits of doing nothing? Okay. And sometimes you find it's better to not to do all these ambitious things because it's just not worth the payoff. I'll give you the best example of this is in Germany with the Energiewende. In 20 years, they added a lot of wind and solar, but the energy demand has gone down. Now, if you start adding capacity while your demand goes down, what's going to happen? You're not going to be able to sell your electricity at a profit anymore because you've got economically inefficient assets. And we're seeing this in many countries where people are building, we said hydrogen, we're building solar, we're building wind, we're building nuclear, we're building all these glamorous things at a
Mm.
premium sometimes. And the only reason why many of these projects work is because governments give them a guaranteed takeoff agreement. And if
Mm.
there's no takeoff agreement or subsidy or anything, they would not be bankable. So that's
Mhm.
an economically inefficient asset at the moment. And the question people have to start asking is, with everything we're asking people to build, how are we going to will those assets, okay, ever pay themselves back? And in many
Indeed.
cases, I think they're going to be pieces of art, and it's going to be debt for future generations. And that to me
Mhm.
is the biggest critique against this whole thing is we are not weighing these things off in trade-off analysis.
So I like your approach to thinking here, Hugo. It's interesting you referenced the brownfield analysis, looking at what you already have and understanding both the benefits and even the benefit of not doing anything and enabling the market basically to be able to work
Yeah.
at these energy questions and let them innovate. No government's going to be more innovative than the private sector in this case. So I'm asking our audience, what do you think? We'd love your questions. This is a fascinating discussion. We've gone from, gosh, we can be skeptical about the hydrogen economy. It's certainly part of the solution, but not quite yet. We've got opportunities in Canada galore, especially as the world changes and energy consumption shifts. And we've just heard a great insight about, what is really going through the mind of the president of Germany and the pressure to deal with this energy issue. These energy policies matter to all of us. And if we don't get it right, there's going to be a lot of consequences. So one of the questions I have is any country doing the quote net transition to zero right, Hugo? Wow. Tell us
Well,
who's getting it right out there.
I mean, you can see that the problem of energy is it is global, and the subsidies are global. So if you were to say, is a country in the is the UAE, for example, doing it right? I would say yes, but that's often because they're banking in on the subsidies that another government is paying. Okay,
Mm.
so you must first, sort of look at this thing. I see the US states, the US has a good and open debate about it. I don't think all their states are doing it well. But I mean, even if you take Republican states in the US, they 30-40% renewable. Now you would say, okay, the critiques against that would say, what does it cost? From the state's perspective, it doesn't matter because the federal government is giving the subsidies. So why wouldn't you bank in on it, right? And that's what that's a point I'd like to make here is a country must evaluate his own position, and if there is subsidies and money sloshing around, why wouldn't you take that cash? Okay, that's the
Yes.
sort of the
Yeah.
argument. That's the argument I put forward. I would say countries that just maintain their infrastructure is doing a little bit better. So, France at once now has made a decision to not build or to basically maintain the nuclear fleet, just overhaul it. Canada in Ontario, I think, is doing a good job as well with the nuclear. There's a few African countries they're going in a different pace. They're starting from nowhere. But many of them have now solved rolling blackouts, for example, and they have solved it with LNG and solar and wind technologies.
Mhm.
So that I think is, it's a good thing if you can do it that way. And then you look at the Scandinavian countries, which I always hold up as a good example, but you have to take into account they have the benefit of good geography. They've got all this water sitting in Norway, for example. So the Norwegians
Mhm.
are doing what Canada should be doing. They were not saying what they're doing, but they're doing the right thing, which is they're using hydro at home and they're exporting the gas on the world market. So if you look at domestically, the
Hmm.
Norwegians are some of the cleanest countries, okay, in terms of
Interesting.
consumption. But if you count in exports, they're one of the top 10 polluters.
So that is so ironic. So we could actually learn in Canada from other countries. So if you were prime minister for a day or a premier of one of our provinces, what would you be doing? How would you advise Canada to go forward with better energy policy? I know that's a big question, Hugo, but you've got an incredible perspective from the
Well,
world. What would you advise?
I would first say this is there must be a debate as to what is the real role of the government in this, first of all. Is
Mm,
it really the government's position to say what our energy policy ought to be or what we need to do? With nuclear, it's a bit complicated because it needs some level of state backing. So if I was sitting in Ontario, for example, I would say continue nuclear because the supply chain is localized and it all works. But it will be an admission that there is some level of state involvement there because of the
mhm,
nature of the technology. Okay. If you were to say you were sitting in Alberta, okay, which, with the natural gas and stuff, I would just say find a market for your product and let the best product compete because that speaks to what the country's done historically, anyways.
mm,
So you should not deviate away too much from what you historically. But let's say the big critique I would say, or the big question I would ask any minister or any person involved in this is, in all your analysis, just tell me what this costs compared to my existing system.
mhm,
Okay, come up with that analysis, and then we say, okay, what is the adaptations that we're going to make? One
mhm,
of the big question marks around the renewables in particular is the upgrades to the grid, for example. They will all tell you the levelized cost of electricity has gone down. That's all true. But what is the grid cost of doing? What is the upgraded distribution system? And what is the total system cost of system one compared to system two? And then
mhm,
you've got, for example, in Germany, you've got a lot of renewables being pushed, but then they have natural gas standing idle to meet their full demand. And I asked the question, what does it cost to keep a system standing idle? And is that taken
mhm,
into account in your full analysis? So I would like to see transparency about the analysis and people with real expertise actually analyzing it and not,
mhm,
as a catchphrases or the president saying, well, we don't need this, so we
mhm.
need this.
I think that's really good advice. So transparency in any of our analysis is really critical. I think of senior fellow Graham Lane, he used to be the chair of the Manitoba Utilities Commission, is really good at that very question. I think looking at the transparency, what are the real costs of this energy source, and how do we then build out a house that is enduring and is sustainable? And so on that front, I guess one of the questions I have is I am truly shocked by the level of subsidies that governments insert in this system. It is just unbelievable the amounts of money, as I'm sure they're well over trillions of dollars. So why do they do this, and how does this serve anybody except special interests, Hugo, when you have all that kind of money sloshing around in the system where the people pay more in their taxes or direct to indirect costs? Like, how does this serve anybody except special interests?
Well, it obviously doesn't. But the challenge of this whole thing is this. In most countries, especially Western countries, you can predict what is demand. France has 60 gigawatt. It hasn't changed
Mhm,
since the 1990s. I think mid 2000s they peaked or something like that.
mm, mhm,
So you have a captured market, a saturated market. There's a lot of electricity to sell if you're in the market, right? But if you're out, you're out. So if you build a
mhm,
nuclear plant, you lock everyone else out for 40 years because that's your life cycle of the plant, 40 to 60 years. And what I found, and this was especially true in South Africa, and I would not be surprised if this is also the case in Canada, is that the Department of Energy is a very critical position for bribery and grift. A good example of this, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa's brother-in-law, is the biggest investor in renewable energy.
Oh
Okay,
my. Hmm.
so this is an obvious form of corruption taking place,
Those
and
brother-in-laws.
yeah, and so now you can imagine now you're sitting at the Department of Energy, and they all have these IRPs, these integrated resources plan, where they try and figure out what the future demand is for the country and what goes into
Mhm.
the computer model and black box. Nobody can figure out except them. And that position or those bureaucrats become very key for bribery and for subsidies and for all these type
Hmm.
of things being handed out. And
Interesting.
this is the biggest issue to me, is the amount of discretionary power that exists within the energy system. Somebody shouldn't be able to hand out subsidies to begin with. Okay, before we can say how much we should have, it should not be able to determine what is the electricity
Mm.
mix for Canada, for example. That shouldn't be a master plan.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a bit of central planning.
Yeah.
It should be a master
Right.
type of thing. And yet, in Western countries, we do this. We actually practice this, and then we are surprised with the amount of grift and subsidies and
Mhm.
hidden tariffs and all these things going on into the system.
No, I think you make a fantastic point, Hugo. Don't give the subsidies. Don't even let them be able to make the subsidies, because otherwise it'll be like flies to sugar, and you'll have all kinds of problems, right?
That's right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think you're right, Hugo. So if you look at the future, one of the questions we have from the audience is, are we going to run out of oil and gas?
No,
Good question.
uh, it's just simply no. The way you need to argue is like an economist, not an engineer. Okay, and I'm an engineer. So engineers think of it like a stock, like it's gonna we've got a certain amount of oil, it's gonna run out. Where
Mhm.
economists understand that there's many more variables at play, and scarcity is measured ultimately by the price. And if you look at the price of gas and the price of oil, it's been going down over a long period of time. That's true of all
Yes,
commodities, by the way. So in other words,
yes,
we've gotten much better at extracting, much more efficient at using it. And look at the people who predicted peak coal. They predicted peak coal and peak oil because we're going to run out of it. And now they're predicting it because they say there won't be a demand for it, which is an admission that they got their previous prediction wrong. In other words, they're saying we've got so much sun and so much wind, which is
right.
theoretically also true, and so much nuclear
Hmm.
that you don't need to
Hmm.
actually extract all the oil in the coal. So no,
Hmm.
there's no scarcity of energy. I just don't believe that.
Okay, so you've heard that today from Hugo. There's no scarcity of energy, and don't be simplistic. When you have something that's a little bit less or harder to get, the price is going to go up and people innovate. It's amazing
Yeah.
the adaptation in industry. You look at how much your car runs on fuel today, it's like night and day versus, well, whenever. So I think that's pretty amazing. So in this case, Hugo, as we look at the future, um, oh, here's a question from our audience. Why is the government against supporting our oil and gas industry?
Another excellent question. And the politicians, and this is probably with the climate scare, they've been made to feel ashamed of their best product. And it's not just the politicians, it's sometimes the executive of the oil and gas companies or even the nuclear industry. I've never understood this, why they
Yes.
themselves would want to be ashamed. I mean, I know a guy an investor who was investing in Africa in coal. And I
Yeah.
would go onto his website, and I had to go to the third page of the link before I could find out he was actually
Mhm.
building a coal power station in Senegal. Okay. So the people who are into the product themselves feel ashamed of defending their own product.
Isn't that fascinating? So you think there's a bit of a psychology here where we should be not ashamed, but we should be proud. Certainly in this context, the Canadian oil and gas industry has done an unbelievable job. And I think they're recognized. I mean, you tell me, Hugo, but I think Canadian oil and gas
Yep.
industries are recognized as among the leaders in this world in terms of their technology, their innovation. And frankly, I mean, obviously, I would suggest that Canada could benefit, and as well as the world could benefit from more Canadian oil and gas. I mean, I just find it bizarre that in Eastern Canada we tend to import oil from dictators using who knows what kinds of environmental standards. I mean, the irony is just really profound, isn't it, Hugo?
Yeah, I mean, this is the other one is that if you don't do the oil yourself or get it from democratic countries, the demand does not go down. It means they will import from dictatorships, if you
Yeah,
will.
the
But
demand
yeah, to
keeps
get to
going
your
up.
point on Canadian oil, look, Canadian oil and gas executives and people who work in the industry are top notch. They compete with
Mm,
the
indeed.
Dutch, with the Russians, with the Qataris, with everyone.
Hmm.
There's nothing to be ashamed of. But there is something to this psychology that we cannot come to be proud of our own product. And that's a sociological issue. It's not that the product doesn't perform; it's that we feel ashamed of it, even if it performs.
Okay, well, let's speak up and tell your friends in the oil and gas industry, to our audience, to uh, speak up and be proud of what we're doing. We're making a positive difference in our world. So, um, and I do want to tell you on that note, um, I got to know a former minister of finance in British Columbia, Michael DeYoung, and it's interesting. One of his portfolios that was lesser known was he was called the Minister of LNG. And people don't realize the story that on the coast, and I bet you know this story, Hugo, because you're a very knowledgeable expert. On the west coast, there were some 24 serious LNG export projects that
Mm.
were about getting Canadian LNG to the world markets. And it's astounding that only one of them to date has gone ahead. And meanwhile, you have a whole flood of other projects happening in the United States, Australia, and all the rest. And we're basically leaving all that opportunity on the table. It's to me, it's just an utter tragedy and shame.
And
Um,
this is destruction through policy. It's what I would call systemic sabotage. Um, uh, uh, uh,
Systemic sabotage. Interesting.
I mean, if the best example of where this took place is towards the end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia at the time, had a
Yes.
certain set of advisors that advised them to basically sell off all the assets for scrap. And that
Mm,
led to the rise of the oligarchs. And that's one of the reasons why
indeed.
Vladimir Putin is in power today. Okay, so you
Yes.
caused enormous harm. Um, why, again, you go back to the permits. Was there an economic reason not to grant those permits or go ahead with those products? Probably not. Was there a political reason? Yes. So all that planning, all that thinking, everything that goes into it is now gone. And whatever competitive advantage Canada might have had, because maybe you were building at scale at the time, maybe you had
Mm,
engineers, you are now going to have to start, maybe not at zero again, but not at the same level you were if those projects were to go
mhm,
ahead. And
mhm,
this is, we see this a lot, especially in the nuclear industry, where regulations keep on changing or permits keep on getting
mhm.
blocked or things just don't go through. And then the workforce retire. And then when the industry wants to start building again, it doesn't work. And then the exact same people who caused the problems would go and say, you can see how uncompetitive they now are. So they've actually
So
sabotaged it to create the problem so they can blame the industry. And
so there
that's what I
you've
would accuse them of.
Hugo, you're teaching us a lot today on June 20th. Another word, systemic sabotage, folks. So remember that word, systemic sabotage, by policy or bad policy, and that doesn't hurt. Like that just it really disturbs me because all that opportunity for every Canadian, including hundreds of First Nation communities, were very enthusiastic
Yeah.
about this. There was the odd one that was not, but I've spoken with so many of those chiefs and other leaders. They are enthusiastic about those opportunities because they see it. Like if you speak with Dale Swampy and other incredible leaders, they're all over this. So it just bothers me. So I have another question from the audience. Do you think it will ever be possible for us to all drive electric vehicles by 2030, like the government wants? Um, and will that even help the climate? There you go. There's
Uh,
another whopper of a question.
by 2030, I'm skeptical. So the question of electric vehicles is the same as the question of batteries. Yes, the
Hmm.
price is falling, but have they fallen further enough so that they can have mass adaptation for the middle class? And at the moment, battery utility or battery vehicles, electric vehicles, is competitive with sports utility vehicles. They
Mm.
are getting into that class, and maybe Elon Musk as an entrepreneur or somebody else figures it out. And if that happens, it's all the better. Will it make any difference to the temperature of the climate? Yeah, I mean, I very much doubt it. I'm quite of a heretic on the climate issue, but
Mhm.
I think even if we met all our net zero targets, which we are not, by the way, I don't think it's going to make any difference.
Okay.
I- you know,
So the answer would be no and no. Okay.
yes, long nose.
Yeah. Okay. So no and no. So very interesting discussion. And I think one of the questions I have for you, Hugo, as we're kind of in the last part of this discussion, is really the future. What can we do to really move this forward? Like I look at so much of the debate and discussion. I think one of the things that you've taught us today, Hugo, is to really think critically about energy policy as it relates to our lives. And if we don't get that energy policy right, we're in deep trouble. So why does this really matter to us? Like, what's the bottom line in terms of as we look to the future? Why does this policy matter? And what can we do, about this as
So,
citizens?
why the policy matters is quite simple to me. If you take the second law of thermodynamics, it's energy in, energy out. Energy is always conserved in the system. So economic activity can be explained by the amount of joules used in a system, if you will. It works for most of the economy, not for art and things. So it's a prerequisite for economic prosperity. Much of the industrial economy depends on energy. Okay. Why it is poorly understood, I would say, is because of the conclusions we made from the Industrial Revolution. And there's a very good book on this I can recommend the audience called Energy and the English Industrial Revolution by Sir Anthony Wrigley. And the point he made is that Western understanding of the Industrial Revolution
Mm.
came from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and to some extent Karl Marx even. Okay. And only actually Karl Marx got it right, but for the wrong reasons, where he said energy was the prime mover. It's in Das Kapital. Smith and Ricardo wrote before Newton's discoveries. So physics was never part of the story as to why we got
Mhm.
out, which is why our leadership today tend to be economists and lawyers. Okay, if you look at our parliament. Whereas if you go to Japan, I think the Asian countries have it right, and that's maybe the countries to look at is Japan and China even. Their
Mm.
leaderships tend to have technical qualifications. And the reason
Mm.
is during the Meiji Restoration, Japan sent out lots of experts to study what went on in the West. And they
That's
came
right.
to one conclusion.
Hmm.
It was iron and coal and steel.
Hmm.
Okay, iron.
Yes.
And they said it was coal. And they understand energy intuitively. And that's why you can look at the Asian countries, all of them. It's not just people blame China, but it's China, it's Japan, it's South Korea, it's all of them. They're looking at this entire energy transition through a lot more skepticism than our own leadership is doing.
Mhm.
And I would say we can maybe go and send an expedition back to Japan and say, what do you understand?
That's right. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating history, and I think you're right. Is that as Japan came into that um, Renaissance period, it was a profound, very methodical and systematic observations of what made the West successful. So it's almost like we need to renew our knowledge about this policy area if we're to kind of go to the next level. And it's not easy because there's so much rhetoric and nonsense out there. But I am just very appreciative, Hugo, that we could have this conversation. And with our audience, there's a lot of good questions that came in. And Hugo, if you look at the next stage of hydrogen, just to get back to that energy source, where do you think the next breakthrough will be on hydrogen as we look forward?
Well, I honestly, my honest view at the moment is none of the hydrogen technologies are mature enough for me to say that they're going to be anything other than boondoggles.
Interesting.
It seems to me that it's a big bubble waiting to pop. And you can say, okay, I'm the heretic saying this. People who are invested into renewables, Michael Library, Mark Jacobson at Stanford, I mean, these are some of the green
Mhm.
ayatollahs, if you will, have been saying the same thing I'm saying. So you can read their work. I mean, say read the work that the renewable pushers and proponents are saying, and they're saying, guys, hydrogen is not adding up. The math is not adding up. And that's my, from first principles, that's my conclusion. They come from it from maybe another perspective, but if there's an investor going into hydrogen, I would just say, you cross your T's and dot your I's. Something isn't adding up to me.
So there you have it. We're so glad that Hugo Kruger could join us today. And he has challenged us to do the math, to do the critical thinking around these options, because energy policy, including energy sources such as hydrogen, matter to figuring this out, is because we're all in it together in terms of our prosperity and standard of living. So thank you very much, Hugo, for all your leadership and for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it.
So thank you to the audience for joining us. That wraps up this conversation this week. Be sure to join us next Thursday, the same time. We'd love to hear your comments. And next week, we're going to be talking about a number of things, including around Aboriginal land acknowledgements. What do they mean? What's their background? What do you think about them? We'd love to hear you. So be sure to join us for our next conversation. And we're so glad you could join us today.